Greetings. So this is our third of 5 screencasts, and this one we're specifically going to look at our fertilizer nutrients, talk about which of our 18 plant essential nutrients are considered our fertilizer nutrients. There's 3, and then we're going to talk about some environmental problems associated with 2 of those 3. So if we look at our fertilizer nutrients, and this is a bag of superior quality fertilizer, and on the bag you'll always see on any bag, bottle, or box of fertilizer 3 numbers, and those numbers correspond to the 3 fertilizer nutrients, which are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So the first number, 19 there, represents 19% nitrogen. The second number is always the percent of P2O5, and the third number is representative of the percent of K2O. And by law, any bag, bottle, or box of fertilizer must have the percentages of those 3 fertilizer nutrients that are in it. So here's the table that you've seen before, and what we're looking at, of course, are our 3 fertilizer nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And I'm showing you this slide just to remind you of the forms that those nutrients are going to exist in the soil. So nitrogen will exist in one of 2 forms: ammonium, NH4+, or nitrate, NO3-. And by far, the form of nitrogen that's most common and that plants are going to take up in greatest quantities is the anionic form, or nitrate. If we look at phosphorus, phosphorus exists as phosphate. It's also an anion, and it exists in one of these 2 forms, and they're both called phosphate. And then finally, potassium exists as a cation, and plants take it up as such, and it's just K+. So if we talk about now our environmental problems, 2 of the 3, as I said before, have some environmental problems associated with them, and that's nitrogen and phosphorus. So what we're going to do right now is kind of talk about what sort of the main environmental problem is associated with nitrogen and phosphorus. And the main problem has to do when the nitrogen and phosphorus are applied to soils or applied to the land from either industrial processes in the form of wastewater and runoff from municipal and residential areas, seepage from septic tanks, or just soils in these residential areas. That means leaching, or runoff or leaching or seepage from agricultural areas. So when you have that happening, the nitrogen and phosphorus that was associated with any of these sources makes its way into water. That's where the problems start. So it's not necessarily a soil problem per se, but what it is it's related to when these substances, the nitrate and the phosphate, are placed on the soil and then by some process get moved to a water system. And it could be a freshwater system, or it could be a salt water system. And the problem, we'll talk about what that is in the next couple slides. So the problem is called eutrophication, and I'll define what I mean by eutrophication in a minute, but what you're looking at is Baja California, and in the middle between Baja California and mainland Mexico is the Sea of Cortez, and eutrophication is associated with algae bloom. So that's what the green is that you see right here in the Sea of Cortez, and then along the coast of Pacific coast of Baja California. So here's some other examples of eutrophication taking place on the East Coast, in the Chesapeake Bay, around the Maryland area, and again it's associated with these green areas here, and the green areas are associated with big, massive blooms of algae. And then we can talk also about the Mississippi River watershed and the Mississippi River basin. So that's this green shaded area right here. So all that area drains into tributaries of the Mississippi River, and then eventually to the Mississippi River, which makes its way out, or its outflow is in Louisiana, and you see all these algal blooms here, which are associated with excess nitrogen and phosphorus being applied to soils in some form or another, and then moving into streams or waterways, and then essentially contaminating those streams and waterways, and either causing eutrophication in those freshwater systems or in the saltwater systems that those freshwater systems drain to. And so what this shows you right here is that the Mississippi River watershed or basin is 3 million square kilometers, and every year 1.5 million tons of nitrogen is added to the Mississippi River, and 50% of that is from agriculture. So not all of it is from ag, but half is from ag and half is from other processes, which means that urban, industrial processes as well as agriculture needs to look at how the nitrogen and phosphorus is making its way into our water system so that we can figure out a way to clean that stuff up. So here is an up-close version of what eutrophication looks like. You got this big mat of algal tissue that's dead on the surface of the water, and it diminishes and essentially kind of upsets ecosystems as a whole, aquatic ecosystems as a whole, and causes a whole shift in a natural habitat. So what happens, and I'll describe sort of how this happens in this slide and in the next couple slides, is that the nitrogen and phosphorus make their way into water systems, right? And when they make their way into the water systems, the organisms that are photosynthesizers, like algae and seaweed and plankton, they start growing like crazy because they are limiting in nitrogen and phosphorus. And so once that nitrogen and phosphorus enters the system, they have everything that they need to grow like crazy, and so they do, and they outcompete everything else. So they grow and grow and grow, and then eventually, right, they're going to consume that nitrogen and phosphorus, they're going to complete their life cycle, and they're going to die. And then when they die, various decomposing organisms, and especially bacteria, come in and break down that dead algal tissue. And when they break down that dead algae or the dead seaweed or the dead phytoplankton, they start consuming oxygen, right? And as the bacteria consume the oxygen, they remove it from the water. And what eutrophication then means is that it's just a water system that's depleted in oxygen. So when you hear someone say that system has gone eutrophic, it just means that it's limited in oxygen. And so the organisms that require oxygen for respiration begin to die, like fish and like various crustaceans. So this slide kind of sums it up. It's basically a three-step process. You got excess nitrogen and phosphorus. They stimulate, these photosynthesizing organisms. In fresh water, it's mostly phosphorus that's the culprit of this, and in saline waters and oceans, it's mostly nitrogen. So the second step then is that the algae, after they've grown like crazy, they will die, and then bacteria, come in and decompose that material. And as the bacteria are decomposing that material, they require oxygen, so they're consuming oxygen in the water system, and then that depletes the oxygen in that aquatic environment, and that'll destroy fish populations. It'll cause turbidity or cloudiness in the water, which decreases light penetration to other photosynthesizing organisms, and it essentially just causes a major shift in the ecosystem. So let's talk about now how we can manage and how we can specifically understand nitrogen and phosphorus. And it turns out that they're pretty different in terms of their chemical properties. So in order to understand how to manage those nutrients, we need to understand a little bit about the chemistry associated with each of them. And so that's what we'll do in the next couple slides. And incidentally, we talk about nitrogen and phosphorus as our fertilizer nutrients. And the reason why nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium are considered our fertilizer nutrients is because they're added in large quantities to soils. And nitrogen is by far the nutrient that's added in largest quantities to soils. And if you look at soils all around the world, nitrogen is the one that's going to most likely be limiting for plant growth. That's why it's added in such high concentrations. Phosphorus is probably the second most limiting for plant growth, and potassium depends on the system, but it can be the third most limiting nutrient for plant growth. But it's definitely nitrogen first, and most of the time phosphorus after that. Breaking up our nitrogen and phosphorus and talking about management of each. So the main forms that we find nitrogen in the soil are the ones that we talked about before. Nitrate is the anion, and ammonium. You could find a neutral form of nitrogen called ammonia, but it's not super important. The main form, though, is this anionic nitrate. And since nitrate is negatively charged and it has the same charge as soil particles do, it's going to be repelled by those soil particles, so it's super mobile in the soil environment, and it can just leach down and make its way into groundwater. And once it makes its way into groundwater, it can flow to, streams or rivers or even oceans, right, as subsurface flow with the groundwater. The other thing about nitrate is that since it is negatively charged and since it's super mobile or easily leachable, it also can move with runoff water. So if you have water that's running off your soil surface, like I've drawn with this red arrow on this cornfield, you can lose nitrogen from an irrigation event by runoff or a large rain event. So it definitely needs to be managed, right? Because it's super mobile, it's super leachable, and like I said, it moves by surface runoff, and it also moves by subsurface flow through a soil profile. That is to say, it's very leachable. So we pretty much talked about what's happening in this slide here. Just the nitrate losses, and those losses, right, are going to be by surface runoff and by subsurface flow into the groundwater, and then subsequent migration with groundwater in whatever direction it's flowing. So phosphorus is different. And the reason why phosphorus is different, though it is an anion, right, phosphorus is super reactive with soil particles. And so it doesn't leach. And what that means is that it's not going to move with water flowing through the soil profile, right? It's going to be held onto by soil particles very strongly, and so it can't move that way. The only way that it can move is by surface runoff or erosion. And so if we talk about the quantity of phosphorus that can start causing problems associated with eutrophication, it's a really small quantity. So here you can see in red 0.03 parts per million. So what is 0.03 parts per million? So 0.03 parts per million is the amount of phosphorus. So it's the amount of phosphorus that I have in the palm of my hand, basically here, added to a large hotel swimming pool. So not a very high concentration of phosphorus is gonna or can lead to a eutrophic water system. So the way that phosphorus moves, and this should say phosphate, right? H2PO4. So I'm sorry about that problem there, but you get the idea, H2PO4 minus. So the way that phosphate moves, because it's so reactive with soil particles, is that it cannot leach through the soil profile. The only way that it moves is by surface runoff, and the way that it's going to move is that it's going to be attached to soil particles. So let's say that here's a big soil particle right here, and if you get erosion, if you get a significant amount of rainfall or irrigation, then attached to those soil particles, it can move off site and make its way into a water system. So how do we manage eutrophication, and how do we limit the migration of nitrogen and phosphorus from various systems, not just agriculture, but urban environments or residential areas, to our waterways? So the main way to do it is to protect our riparian areas or our stream areas. And what this slide is showing you is what's called a buffer strip. And the buffer strip essentially starts at the end of this cultivated cornfield and is all this vegetation here, that's essentially, a couple, 20 or 30 meters of land that you're going to plant specific type of vegetation on to reduce or the amount of runoff that you get and also the leaching losses of your nutrient. So what you're looking at here, then these arrows are showing the top red arrow is showing runoff losses. And the way that you mitigate those runoff losses is by this berm right here and then the planting of a grass. And so what that grass does and what that berm does is going to filter the water and essentially slow it down and cause it to move into the soil profile instead of running off. As we move down from our cultivated area towards our stream or our riparian area, we shift from grasses to then shrubs, which have deeper roots, right? Here's our root system here. And then to our trees. So our trees have even deeper roots than our shrubs. And what that is allowing to happen is that the nitrogen, right, which moves with groundwater, not so much the phosphorus, but the nitrogen, it can be intercepted by these deep plant roots and essentially taken up by them and stored in the above ground biomass, thereby reducing the subsurface migration of nitrate or nitrogen into our stream system here. So it's a very effective management system, but the thing is that it takes up potentially cultivated area or potentially developed area, and so it hasn't always been done in the past, but certainly it's being done more and more now. So here's an example of a buffer strip in a cultivated, looks like cornfield. So there's our grassy area right there. There's some shrubs and then some trees, and then our stream system kind of flows like this through here. And essentially what the landowners are doing here are enhancing the water quality by mitigating the transport of nitrogen and phosphorus that may have been applied to these soils over here by fertilizer application.